Hello everyone, we are here at the Gordon Highlanders Museum and we're here today to speak to Jamie, one of the members of the staff. Jamie, thanks very much for joining us.
No problem at all, my absolute pleasure.
So, can you give us a brief intro into the Gordon Highlanders?
Absolutely, yeah. So the Gordon Highlanders is a famously Aberdonian regiment. We are currently in the museum, which is located in the west end of Aberdeen. And it was originally started in 1794 by the Duke of Gordon and was assisted in recruiting by the Duchess Jean, who famously offered a kiss to anyone who took up the King's shilling. Understandably had a long queue out in Aberdeenshire, and so it's a bad timing.
Sorry.
That's all right. You'll come back. It's no problem. No worries. Yeah, so famously had a long queue of men wanting to join up to the regiment, and so the recruiting area was Aberdeenshire, and the regiment was lasted for about 200 years, so 1794 to 1994, and our museum documents that history from the very beginning all the way up until amalgamating with the Highlanders, and yeah. That's where we are now.
So, the location of the museum, why this building? What's the connection with this building?
So this building was actually, when it was first built, had nothing to do with the regiment at all. It was actually a coffee merchant's house to begin with, and then ends up becoming an artist's house, a man named Sir George Reed. And he basically converted the building into what he intended to be an artist's paradise. So the main exhibit where most of our items are, which we call the Grant Room, that was actually his main studio that he worked in. And he basically lived out the rest of his life in this building. And the Gordon's barracks at the time was already in Aberdeen. And this ends up basically, once George Reed ends up passing away and leaving the building, this ends up becoming the regimental headquarters for the Gordon Highlanders. And it's basically that for a very, very long time, up until around about the 90s, after the Gordon Highlanders amalgamates into the Highlanders, and that's when it becomes a museum. And that was established by Sir Peter Graham, and one of the most legendary Gordon Highlanders that we kind of celebrate. And yeah, and that's basically why it's here and why it is a museum today.
You're mentioning there about some of the legendary Gordon Highlanders. Shall we go and take a look at some of the legends?
Absolutely, let's do it.
So you mentioned about Duchess Jean.
Correct.
So can you
yes.
explain more about her?
Yes. So Duchess Jean was kind of the original recruiter, basically, for the Gordon Highlanders, and she was basically ordered by the Duke of Gordon, the Marquis of Huntly at the time, to basically ride around Aberdeenshire. They were based in Huntly. To basically ride around and basically help recruit men to the regiment in 1794. And as the story goes, she supposedly offered a kiss out to anyone who agreed to join the regiment. So once you'd taken the King's shilling, you could go and get a kiss from Duchess Jean. And as I said, famously, queues of men hoping to join up to the regiment. Now, kind of multiple interpretations of the story, whether or not it was that, or whether or not it was her holding the King's shilling in between her teeth and the men had to basically climb up onto the horse that you can see in that painting and get the King's shilling out from between her teeth. It was one of those stories, but either or, that's kind of the origins of the 92nd Regiment of Foot, which was originally numbered the 100th Regiment of Foot. Either or, that's the original Gordon Highlanders Regiment. That ends up becoming the Gordon Highlanders in 1882. So, as you can see, painting there depicting her handing out the King's shilling to some of the men in Aberdeenshire. And then in our case here, we've got our feather bonnet, and then kind of a gross one, but I think it's quite cool, some lockets of her hair inside a wee piece of jewellery there that you can see. So that's always a really, really fascinating one that gets people really interested straight off the bat.
Do we know how the museums came by obtaining these items? Is this something that's always been in the possession of the museum, or is this something that's been handed in? Or?
These ones have been in the possession of the museum for a long time, basically before it was a museum. So a lot of the original collection, including the really old items like these ones, were originally part of the barracks and the regimental headquarters. and basically, and also kind of part of the mess hall as well. So some of the silver that we might talk about later on, that was part of the mess hall. And then when it becomes a museum in the 90s, it's almost kind of instantly accessioned into the collections. That's where a lot of these items come from. They've just kind of always been part of the collection. Some of the kind of newer items, they've kind of come in over time. So we've got a donation process where people can get in touch, typically with myself, and we can kind of go over the items, and if there's really interesting stories behind them and they're specifically to do with the Gordon Highlanders, then we're all about it. So I guess kind of legend number 2, really, and certainly one of the most interesting stories that's a real attention grabber when we talk about it in the museum is that of Robert Watt. And so it's mostly to do with this description book. So this was the first description book in 1794. So this dates from between 1794 and 1809. And that's basically everyone who was recruited into the 92nd Regiment of Foot basically put their name, their age, their occupation into this book. So that was basically all the information, their personal information was stored in here. And famously, Robert Watt is mentioned in this book. What makes Robert Watt so special? Robert Watt is the single youngest person to ever join up to the Gordon Highlanders. And I usually make people guess, come in when they come into the museum. I take a wild guess. I won't do that. I'll tell you straight up, he was 9 years old when he joined the regiment. And he was a drummer boy to begin with, and was a drummer boy throughout his entire career, which ended up spanning 21 years of service with the Gordon Highlanders. So his name is in that book, and then we've also got his medals in this other case as well. And you'll see possibly in the footage that on his medals, he's got, I think it's 6 bars or 7 bars on his medal. So that's 7 major conflicts that he was part of during his career. And it's completely fascinating to think that someone that age, even to begin with, was part of battle at that age and then continued to serve for another 20 plus years. It's a fascinating story, and kind of goes to show the sheer will and determination of the Gordon Highlanders, and the tenacity of them. So fascinating.
But just try and imagine being at that age and surrounded by men that are being fired upon by muskets and artillery. It must take some form of courage. Maybe it's boy courage.
Yeah.
To not break in that situation.
Next level of courage. I mean, and fortitude, and as I say, tenacity, and that was something that the regiment itself was pretty famous for. And so that's kind of why I think Robert Watt is kind of so important to kind of talk about, is he's kind of a testament to that. And as I was kind of briefly talking about before, this diorama here actually does pretty well to kind of illustrate what conflict during that time was like. But also you can see a drummer boy who, a lot older than Robert Watt would have been. So if you kind of take his size, probably plonk it down there, half size, that's probably pretty accurate to where he would have been. But really goes to show that he was in the nitty-gritty, he was in the thick of it. So yeah, no, it's a real testament to the tenacity of it. Absolutely.
So up next is what are personal favourites of yours, I believe?
A few personal favourites of mine, yeah. So we're going to start to get into our kind of ocean of Victoria Crosses, I guess, that we have. There's 19 Victoria Crosses that are associated with the Gordon Highlanders. We are lucky enough to have, I think it's 11 of them in our collection. And so it's a really, something that's really great about this museum is that we try and display all of our Victoria Crosses, so you can come in and see them in person. And I guess we may as well talk about them and have a look at them. So
sure.
On we go. So we're in the realm of Victoria Crosses, certainly the beginning of them. And I think probably we'll start with what is considered one of our most famous ones, again, kind of going to show about the tenacity of the Gordon Highlanders and the courage of the Gordon Highlanders, that being Piper George Finlater. And as the story goes, he was awarded his Victoria Cross at a battle called the Heights of Dargai in Afghanistan. And whilst he was serving with the Gordons, he was fighting alongside the Gurkhas at the Heights of Dargai. And he's playing his pipes, and he's shot through both of his ankles and loses the ability to walk altogether. And so rather than trying to get to safety or trying to get to medical treatment of any kind, he decides to actually stay where he is. He drags himself up onto a rock and continues playing the pipes. And whilst he's playing the pipes, the men feel incredibly inspired, end up charging up to the top of the hill and taking the heights of Dargai and winning the battle. And so for that and for his gallantry, he's awarded the Victoria Cross, which you can see, that's his Victoria Cross there, and that's a set of his bagpipes there. So he is truly one of the most iconic men that served in the Gordon Highlanders. And you'll see kind of later on, we've got paintings of him and depictions of that battle. And so yeah, he's a favourite of mine for sure.
Even though he's been recognised for this great action, he had a bit of a troubled life once he left the service.
Bit of a troubled life after he left, absolutely, and was effectively homeless for a long time. And it was a real shame, considering that he was such an icon and you know, was kind of captured the imagination of Victorian Britain, basically, and was not just famous within the regiment, but was famous in the UK. But then was effectively homeless and was offering to play the bagpipes for money and things, and it was a real shame. But he's remembered today as one of the most iconic soldiers to have ever served in the Gordon Highlanders.
See, during the action that made him win the VC, do we know what tune it was he was playing?
So in his words, supposedly he was just playing for whatever came off the top of his head. But Cock of the North is what we try and say, and probably what he was playing. And that is actually eventually adopted as the official anthem for the Gordon Highlanders later on into the 20th century. It's the 1930s that gets adopted as the official anthem. But he was clearly playing well, that's for sure. Yeah, whatever it was.
So moving on, is there any other VCs that you in particular you'd like to chat about?
Well, I think we'll talk about William Cunningham, I think that's one that's also equally very interesting, and actually kind of quite similar in a way to Finlitter. Not in the sense that he was injured and was playing the pipes, but again, it's the sense of he was in the same conflict in Afghanistan, and was basically ordered to attack a heavily defended mountain fortification, and in the process basically of leading his men into battle, ends up taking the mountain fortification, saving multiple lives, and leading an amazing offensive. And so again, just gallantry on gallantry, which is what you get Victoria Crosses for. And I think you might have had a little bit of an interesting story as well to do with Cunningham.
Well, at the moment, we are currently doing a video on Cunningham. We're currently filming a video on him because he's connected with the area of Dunningston. He originally stayed at Prestonfield House, him and his family, but they later on moved up here to Aberdeen. There's actually a memorial to Lieutenant Cunningham in Dunningston Kirk, and there's also a memorial to his 10-year-old son. His son, you see, sadly died whilst trying to save his friend, because his friend got into a bit of a situation whilst attempting to swim out in the water. He was concerned that his friend was now close to drowning, so he went out to try and save his friend, but as a result he ended up drowning. So in his honour, the Kirk decided to erect a memorial to him.
So, there we are. Well, that's really fascinating. Maybe we should get an extra label for that as well, yeah. A little bit extra information, that'd be great.
Bravery must run the family.
There we go, exactly. Absolutely, bravery must run through the family. No, that's beyond fascinating. But yeah, another top Victoria Cross. I think we'll maybe talk about not a man in the Gordon Highlanders, but an animal in the Gordon Highlanders, I think, next, in terms of some of my favourites. So there seems to be a little bit of a theme within the regiment of dogs, and dogs being basically the regimental mascots for the Gordon Highlanders. And so one that's kind of probably our most well-known one, that we've actually got her gravestone actually out as you come into the museum. Peggy the dog, who was basically in Singapore during the Second World War, and was basically the garrison's mascot and was also a prisoner of war, basically, and was actually honoured by the Animals in Warfare Association a couple of years ago. But this one's really interesting. This is Juno. As you can see, there's her receiving her medals that we've still got here. And Juno was in Egypt with the Gordon Highlanders, and it was in 1882. It was during the Battle of Tel El-Kebir. It was the men were charging a fortified location, and it was basically almost a kind of set of trenches, basically at Tel El-Kebir. And Juno was so glued to the side of the men that are involved in this combat that she refused to leave them, even as they were charging into battle. And so she was diving into the trenches alongside them during this, basically the heat of battle, and came out the other side unscathed. And so we are really proud to still have our medals for that. And for a long time, off the top of my head, we had a silver dog collar, which is probably still part of the collection. And I used to sit on a chair in the dining room, and no one else could sit there. That was Juno's chair, only Juno's chair. And so yeah, again, gallantry and tenacity. It's a little bit of a running theme here. So there we are. So continuing on with our plethora of Victoria Crosses that we have in the collection, we've got Captain Towse, who was kind of a really interesting story in that he managed to make the famously stony-faced Queen Victoria break down into tears. And this was basically after he served in the Second Boer War. He's effectively shot in the face, and you're going to hear me say he miraculously survived a few times, but this is definitely one of those cases of he miraculously survived. And but in the process, he actually lost his eyesight. And when he's presented in front of Queen Victoria and is given the Victoria Cross, because in the heat of battle, where he had lost his eyesight, he'd saved numerous of his men. When he's presented in front of Queen Victoria to get his Victoria Cross, she famously broke down into tears, which is what this painting is as depicted. And kind of as a result of that, a lot of the first associations for the blind, and specifically for people affected by warfare, was started by Towse. And he's basically nicknamed the Sightless VC as a result of that. And so even though that he can't see, he's still associated with the First World War, and he's vice president of the British Legion, and basically helps aid people as they come back to the country after they're injured in war during the First World War. So really an incredible story of kind of even being injured, kind of still being part of the military, and kind of and still helping his fellow man. Really incredible. On the kind of flip side of his story, and this is a kind of a more amusing side of his story, is to do with this down here. Now, when I've done tours in the past, I've had multiple guesses as to what it is. Toilet brush being one of them, some sort of duster being another. But it's actually an elephant's tail. And this was to do with when Towse went on a hunting expedition in South Africa and ended up shooting an elephant. And I think him and his men kind of forgot that elephants are actually quite heavy. And so they realized we can't get him back to camp. And so they lobbed off his tail and foolishly let themselves get a bit hungry despite being hunting. And so that's actually only roughly about half the tail. They actually ate part of the tail whilst trying to get back. So yeah, that's a little bit of an amusing part of his story. So both amazing and amusing in this case. But yeah, overall amazing, I'd say, with Towse.
Certainly a very interesting man then.
Very, very interesting man. And again, kind of returning to that tenacity story, but also just, amazing on all fronts of life.
Moving on towards the First World War, can you explain who this chap is?
This chap is Captain Brooke, who was 30 years old by the kind of outbreak of the First World War. and was there at the Battle of Ypres in 1914. And basically, at this point, the British Expeditionary Force that was there, certainly kind of at the Battle of Mons, had been incredibly weakened, and so the Germans were launching heavy attacks onto the British army. And whilst at the Battle of Ypres, Brooke basically helped lead effective counterattacks with the Gordon Highlanders against the Germans as they were basically trying to break the British line. Had it not been for Brooke's swift reactions and his tenacity and his ability to basically command the Gordons, there was a good chance that British line probably would have been broken. And so he's killed in action in Ypres and is posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross. And obviously, very interestingly, we again have the actual Victoria Cross here, but on a kind of equally fascinating note, we've got his original grave, or original headstone, I should say. And obviously now there's the Commonwealth Graves Association that has the kind of beautiful white headstones across Europe. But before that, when other Gordons and other soldiers were trying to honour their fellow man, they would build things like this. So that's basically stamped sheet metal with planks of wood basically put together to make a temporary cross. And so, so he's now obviously got a Commonwealth grave somewhere else that depicts that. But we've got that, which is always a really interesting.
It also highlights how much he meant to his comrades, because
Absolutely.
there's a lot of times that a lot of the guys, they had no choice but to leave him.
Absolutely,
These guys have made the effort.
They've made the absolute effort
to try and locate him and give him a decent burial.
Goes to show how much he meant to the regiment and how much he meant to that battalion as well. And I'd say there's the kind of a lot of the kind of nameless people of the First World War in the situations where the exiled they couldn't really do anything about it. So it absolutely shows how much he meant to the Gordons. Kind of as well as part of this case, I always think that the First World War is kind of the first modern war, I suppose. But at the same time, there's lots of elements to it that were kind of fairly medieval, I guess. And so there's kind of two highlights that I kind of like to point out. One being, what is your first gas mask, if you can even call it that? A pair of goggles with what are basically sponges attached to the rims. And that was paired with a rag, and that rag was often dunked in pee, basically, and that was your counteragent to gas attacks, was those and a pee rag. And so eventually you get gas masks later on, which are a little bit more effective, but that kind of goes to show almost kind of technology rapidly evolving, and then the kind of temporary counteragents that were made, and so that really kind of goes to show that, and also just it goes to show the kind of really kind of gritty, grim nature of what the First World War was. And then on a slightly smaller scale, this little dart here, a flechette, and that's actually a German flechette. And the way that I like to describe it is basically your first airstrikes. They would basically just fill up buckets with those, fly over and dump them out over where they thought the opposing trench would have been. And because of the speed that they were falling at, they would have done incredible damage. So that's effectively, a very improvised airstrike, but that's what that was.
It would have been a bit of an intimidating weapon as well, because it's not necessarily something that you'll be able to tell that's coming towards you.
No, it would have been almost silent, basically, until it lands, because they are literally just darts flying through the air. So they would have been basically silent. So it would have been incredibly intimidating. Equally the same with when the gas attacks are first used. I mean, it was basically, they had no idea what was going on. On the other side of that, when the British first introduced the tanks with the land ship, the Germans were basically terrified of it, because they thought that they were almost like dragons kind of moving across the trenches. And your first German tanks are actually just British tanks that have been basically stolen, and they've painted the Iron Cross on the side of them because they were so terrified of them, but enamored by them and amazed by them at the same time. On a kind of happier note, I guess, this little tin here. So that's we call that a Princess Mary gift tin. And basically they were donated to the trenches and the front lines. And I remember someone mentioning to me that it was more chocolate or more tobacco depending on the age of the person. This one's kind of got half chocolate, half tobacco. And kind of that's not really the interesting part about them. The interesting part about them is that they just seem to keep popping up everywhere. And so it was during one of the Queen's last Christmas addresses, one of those tins is on her table whilst she's filming it. And lots of people come in from Australia, New Zealand, all across Europe that just say that in their attics or in their garages, they just find those. There's whole books about the Princess Mary gift tins. They've almost got like a little mini cult following. But it kind of goes to show, to me, it kind of goes to show the kind of war over by Christmas kind of attitude and stuff. And so, and the kind of attempt to keep morale up. Just, yeah, really interesting. Slight cult following around them.
It's always amazing to see them with the original contents as well.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And it's out in our replica trench. We've actually got some original rations that if you've got a tin opener, you can crack them open and get some 100-year-old beans if you want. But you know, there's if you want to keep it really original, that's how original we'll get. Perfect. So yeah, from the end of the First World War, we'll get on to the Second World War. So Second World War actually starts pretty disastrously for the Gordon Highlanders in Europe with the surrender of St. Valery, where basically thousands of Gordon Highlanders are captured and made prisoners of war by the German army. And one artifact in here that kind of is really kind of important to that story, but also kind of shows the connection to Scotland and connection to Aberdeen that the Gordon Highlanders were really, truly passionate about, is that sporran right there. Now, that sporran looks a little bit rough around the edges, and the reason for that is completely handmade from bits lying around in a prisoner of war camp. So someone who was a prisoner of war handmade that using parcels, things that they could find lying around, gifts that were things that were basically being sent into the prison, and ended up handcrafting that so that he could have a sporran to wear to say that he was a Gordon Highlander and that he could remain connected to his basically his family history. So one of my favorite items in the collection, because again, goes to show the real nature of the regiment. It's a very Highland regiment.
That's incredible.
It's amazing, and it's even down to the detail of the cap badge, the antler logo of the Gordon Highlanders being mounted onto it. It's completely amazing.
I wonder if the German guards would have raised a few eyebrows when they
yeah,
seen
what's
the
going
guy
on? Yeah,
fixing it.
exactly. You'd think maybe it would be some sort of contraption to escape or something. It's not, it's a sporran, so they don't have to worry about it per se. But yeah, it's one of the most interesting stories that we've got. Equally, probably as interesting is probably this 4th Battalion tenor drum. And so 4th Battalion, the Gordon Highlanders, were actually one of the many battalions and regiments that were at Dunkirk. And basically they had this tenor drum with them, and they kind of realized during the evacuation that it was it wasn't really much point in carrying the drum, and it was, you know, almost kind of disastrous thing to lose something like this, but they really needed to basically get on with the evacuation. And so they ended up basically burying this drum into the ground to make sure that even though they'd left it, that it stayed safe, and that the Germans basically wouldn't capture it once they'd evacuated and they'd moved along. And it was, as the story goes, it was basically found by a French policeman with part of the drum basically sticking out of the ground in a field, which I think was owned by a farmer at that time. You know, it had actually become farmland at that stage. And in 2010, there was a ceremony to basically return the drum to the regiment, and it's now back in the collection. But yeah, thankfully that French policeman was there and found it. So
It's amazing it's managed to survive
yeah,
under the earth for a period.
And you wouldn't think it looked, you wouldn't think that
it looks
happened
really
to it.
good.
It's in really good nick, yeah, exactly. So from, in 1940 to 2010, it's done all right for itself. So yeah, but yeah, really goes to show again that they really cared about their history and about the kind of iconography and the items that are associated with the regiment. And so in order to protect that, burying it in a field amidst an evacuation. So one of the most interesting items from the Second World War collection. So, outside of that frontier, really, the Second World War, moved to North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, where the 1st and 5th Gordons, as well as the 5th and 7th Battalion Gordons, they'd served in those regions, and so we've kind of got a few items that are to do with that. Probably one of my favourites being Captain Smith's Brodie helmet from the 6th Battalion Gordons, 1943. He was wounded in Tunisia, and basically a piece of shrapnel had gone flying into his head. And I'm going back to my miraculous survival theme again, which is very much the case with Captain Smith. And shrapnel goes into his helmet, and he's of course, there's blood going down his face, and basically the medical staff assumed that if they took the helmet off, that would kill him. And so he's sitting in this hospital for hours with this helmet on, and it basically gets to a point where he's sitting there, sweat and blood going down his face, and he goes, just take it off, right? Take it off. He's completely fine. It just scratched his forehead, hence why the blood was going on, but he survived, and then he was basically given his helmet as a memento to his, once again, miraculous survival. And you look at it and think, that wouldn't have happened, but
You look at it, you think, no, surely
not
there's got
chance.
to be more than just a scratch.
But yeah, he was somehow managed to survive, and he was gifted that, and now it's here.
There certainly seems to be a theme with the Gordons and miraculously surviving
Your
the impossible.
Highland identity compared with a little bit of miraculous survival stories. Which again gives it one of the things that really makes it this museum and this regiment really unique and really special is that Highland connection and also the amazing stories that go through and the survival stories. One that's really interesting, that's actually kind of to do with the Gordons, but also to do with the Paras, is this MP38 here. So MP38 kind of being the earlier version of the more famous MP40. Not much difference between them. The MP40 kind of being better and its looks slightly different. But before, or I should say after Jack Rainey was in the Gordon Highlanders, he was in the 1st Parachute Regiment. And basically in 1943 in North Africa, he ends up basically picking up this MP38 off of a German soldier and ends up liking it so much that he refused to use any other British issued weapon and just decided to use this for the rest of the war. And the interesting thing about it, which a lot of people have kind of come in and asked, especially if they kind of know their stuff, they kind of go, well, how is he getting the ammunition for it? How is he loading it if it's a German gun and they're not getting issued these kind of things? The issued Sten gun 9mm magazines fit into that. So every time that he was getting a Sten gun magazine, he was getting more ammunition for that. So that's how he kept using it for the duration of the war. But yeah, just quite funny that he just liked it that much, and that was it.
That's incredible.
Yeah, yeah, it's really cool. That's a really fascinating one, and we've got a few more weapons downstairs that have got some cool stories attached to them. So, yeah.
So, I think it's time to highlight the East.
Highlight the East, exactly. Yes, let's do it.
This is a face that I recognise straight away.
Absolutely, yeah.
Famous author with the Gordons, Alistair Orcutt. Can you explain more who he is?
Absolutely. Well, I think a little bit of context to the Gordons in the southeast in Singapore. And so the Gordon Highlanders were garrisoned in Singapore kind of before the start of the Second World War and continued to be garrisoned there kind of for the first half of it. And then when Japan joined the Second World War, they end up invading other parts of Asia, and as part of that, they invade Singapore and basically invade the garrisons that were not equipped to deal with a full-scale invasion, basically, and so thousands of Gordon Highlanders are captured as a result of that, and so you end up with some really breathtaking stories of the kind of survival stories of the insane conditions that they were put in, with your prison basically being a jungle. And so one of those stories that's just completely outstanding is that of Alistair Urquhart. So he was 2nd Battalion, the Gordon Highlanders, and he joined up when he was 20 years old. And he's garrisoned in Singapore, and he ends up basically being a prisoner of war right up until the end of the war. So he ends up basically being with the Japanese until 1945. And for that duration, he ends up basically working on the Thai-Burma Railway, often called the Death Railway, effectively. And he's basically survives that experience and ends up being saved by Americans, which was slightly ironic because before he's saved by the Americans, he's actually torpedoed by an American submarine whilst on this boat that's hopefully getting him to safety, survives that. And then American Navy then goes on to rescue the POWs. And whilst he's basically there with the Americans, he ends up witnessing the bomb dropping on Nagasaki. So he effectively sees almost kind of the start and the end of the war in person. I mean, it was completely incredible. By the time that he returns to Aberdeen and is out of the scenario that he was in, he weighed 37 kilograms. He was in the most horrific conditions imaginable. And one of the kind of really interesting things about it is that no one knew his story for years and years and years, and then eventually he came out with the book, The Forgotten Highlander, and then everyone was completely blown away by that. And so we thankfully have this amazing painting of him to display, and we use this as our kind of introduction to the rest of the Eastern Front with the prisoner of war stories. It's a really lovely way to introduce it. As you say, came in, recognised that face, and amazing story.
It's just incredible because when the Japanese invaded Singapore, he was immediately put in charge of 3 young boys.
Yes, yeah.
One of them ended up becoming a very good friend of him, if I'm correct in saying that. His name was Jim,
I think so, yeah, I think it was a Jim, yeah.
He ended up being split between them.
Yeah.
Got separated with him. He got moved to a different camp, they got moved to another camp, but then he was later reunited with Jim when he fell ill.
Yeah. Alistair
cheated death God knows how many times.
Yeah.
And when he met up with Jim, him and Jim spent near enough the rest of the majority of their time in camps with each other, but then that's when Alistair's taken away, put on the ship as you explained.
Yeah.
He cheats death once again, escapes the ship, he's floating in the middle of the Pacific on a little dinghy. He even comes across a Japanese officer who's also on the dinghy. They have a little back and forth.
Yeah.
Japanese officer says, "I'm coming back for you."
Yeah.
Doesn't see the Japanese officer
again.
Don't know what happened to him.
Yeah.
He's eventually picked up. He's then liberated by the Americans. He then again meets up with young Jim.
Yeah.
But as it mentions his book, young Jim doesn't seem to be able to move on as Alistair did.
Yeah.
It seems to torment Jim quite a lot, and sadly Jim dies of alcohol poisoning in the 50s.
Yeah.
Still at a very young age.
Yeah. No, it's just like heartbreaking, but it just unbelievable story. It's one of the most amazing stories that's to do with the Gordon Highlanders, and also just one of the most amazing stories in British history. I think it's breathtaking to say the least.
So, should we move on?
Let's move on.
So, continue with the theme in the East. Can you explain what we've got here?
So what we've got here is basically a collection of items that are basically picked up from a lot of the Gordon's prisoners of war. Things that were given to them whilst they were in the camp, things they picked up when they were liberated. And it kind of just, to me, kind of goes to show a little bit to do with the conditions and the struggles that they were put through. And to me, one of the kind of most underrepresented parts of the Second World War, I think, is the lives of the prisoners of war in Asia and in the East. And I think kind of one of the things to go to show is these shoes, which were the shoes that were basically supplied to the prisoners by the Japanese, that I'd say almost kind of border on like look like they're unwearable, like with these massive steel toes at the front, you know, and considering that they were walking through mud and thick jungle all the time, because it wasn't a traditional prison that you'd think of being put in a cell and it's a building. Your prison was basically the jungle. And it was being kept there and then being made to work on things like the Thai-Burma Railway as an example. So the conditions were unimaginable. And equally, they were kept basically under those conditions, but also incredibly strict conditions by the Japanese. The one main thing being, if you were caught trying to escape, you were executed, no question about it. And so this brings us on to Hamish Johnston, who is, we're back to that miraculous survival story once again, back to that theme. Hamish Johnston is in the middle of trying to escape. He's caught, and basically it's, as I said, he's basically put to execution, and it was probably at the hands of something similar to this katana here, and basically they go to behead him, and it misses his neck, goes into his shoulder, leaves a deep cut in him, and he's left for dead. And he ends up basically waiting for them to leave, and then basically drags himself into a river, and then swims down it, or probably kind of lets himself float down it probably, and then is eventually picked up and taken to a medical centre. And supposedly initially tells them that it was a shark attack rather than what it actually was of them trying to execute him. And so we've got his medals here, and then he's also in that photograph there on the right hand side. And then kind of items that were kind of one of the souvenirs kind of after 1945 was prayer flags. So the Japanese flags that have got multiple kind of prayers of hope for victory in battle and for safety that are written on them. And this one was actually signed by General William Slim, kind of following victory in Burma. And we've had people who can read Japanese point out that the flag is backwards and that all the text is backwards. And that was because William Slim didn't think he obviously couldn't read Japanese, and so he actually signed it on the flip side, hence why it's this way around, so you can see the signatures on the left-hand side. But yeah, as I said, the stories of the Gordon Highlanders in the East of Asia is unimaginable. I mean, it's, as I say, one of the most underrepresented pieces of history, I think, and so we're always really proud to be able to talk about Ali Urquhart and to be able to talk about all the other stories that are here.
It is one of these theatres of the war that just doesn't seem to be getting the same shine as what it is on the Western Front. And it is a shame, because there's just as many interesting and gallant stories in the East than there is in the West.
Absolutely. And I think obviously because the Western Front is a little bit closer to home, I think it's maybe kind of it's more discussed and more talked about here. But this is, as you say, equally amazing stories. And Ali Urquhart and Hamish just being a couple examples of untold stories that are just completely fantastic. So we're always really proud to have this case here. Fantastic. So we kind of get towards the end of the Second World War, back to the European theatre. So kind of something that really goes to illustrate that is this diorama that we've got kind of towards the end of the gallery, which is the Battle for Goch in 1945, which is kind of showing the Allied advance kind of towards Berlin, up until the run-up until the fall of Berlin. And one of the things that I think this diorama does really amazingly is actually kind of go to show one of the key distinct differences I think of between the First and the Second World War, which is kind of urban conflict becoming more of a thing, and kind of close quarters urban conflicts becoming more of a thing, and which is really, really nicely demonstrated by the kind of skeletonized nature of this building here. So you can see the models of British soldiers making their way up through this building, and from the other angle you can see the Germans that are still stationed here that have actually set up booby traps for the British soldiers. So there's boards with nails through them, barbed wire that have been plonked on the stairs, and then holes in walls so they could chuck grenades down them if they thought that they were approaching. So as I say, it goes to show kind of two elements of the war, of the kind of the urban nature of it, and then this is also kind of really showing the beginning of the end of the Second World War, certainly in the European theatre. Which will be the 80th anniversary coming up next year of the end of the Second World War.
Yeah, the model as well, it does capture the sheer desperation that the German forces had faced at this point. Because even looking down here, we can see them trying to make an escape with ammunition into the next building, whilst the Gordons are pushing through.
Exactly. So it is going to show that kind of desperation and kind of starts to kind of show how desperate and how kind of problematic the scenario was for them. And one of the kind of symbols of that for me is actually this, the Panzerfaust, the quite literally armor fist in German. And kind of the reason why I think about that is that they were handing them out to the Hitler Youths, effectively the cadets of the German army, because they were so simple to use. Pull a pin, pull that lever down, you've got a rocket that can hopefully take out a tank. And had it pointed out that Vorsicht is spelt incorrect, it should be Vorsicht, but you know, we'll hopefully try and get that painted over at some point. But yeah, it still goes to show the size of and the simplicity of the Panzerfaust as well. But yeah, that's towards the end of the European theatre. So now we are post-war. So we are into the Cold War, which is kind of less to do with the British Army at this point. It's kind of, roughly speaking, this is a period of peace. There are small proxy combats, conflicts, I should say, that the Gordons are part of, which we'll kind of talk about kind of after this case. This case is kind of show the fraternization between the Gordon Highlanders and the Germans. So after the Second World War, there's lots of Gordon Highlanders battalions that are basically stationed in Germany with the intention of keeping peace across Europe. And there's initially a kind of policy of no fraternization with, you're not meant to be friends with them, you're making sure that you're keeping peace. And in traditional friendly Scottish fashion, they said, not going to do that. We're going to be pals with them. And so there's actually lots of towns across Germany. There's actually a really good relationship between the Gordon Highlanders and the populace of those towns. And so just one example being this script here written in both English and German, which is from the town of Hemer, which is appreciating the close cooperation and friendship between the Gordon Highlanders and the citizens of Hemer. So really going to show that, as I say, yeah, in classic friendly Scottish fashion, Aberdonian fashion even, of saying, yeah, no, we want to be pals with them, want to have a good time. And even this Berlin 1949 plaque here. And then probably my favourite piece in here, I like to call it the first Duolingo, when the government kind of realised that no fraternization policy isn't going to stick anymore. They start realising, well, you may as well learn a bit of German. And so they start issuing vinyl records, modern languages for the forces, letting them listen to a bit of German lessons. And yeah, so I always think that's really fascinating. As I kind of said, there's kind of small pockets of conflicts that kind of the Gordon Highlanders are involved in. And one of those being the Troubles. And so we've got a case here about Northern Ireland. And so kind of one of the things I always find quite fascinating, this patrol map. So all these kind of scribbles and black lines, that was showing the exact patrol routes that the Gordons were basically were going on. And funnily enough, we're back again to the miraculous survival stories again, with Private Davidson. And he was on one of these patrols. This was in the lodge area of Belfast, Turf Lodge, I'd say, of Belfast. And he and one other Gordon Highlander were patrolling through the streets, and there was a sniper set up in what I believe was a church tower. And basically, sniper starts taking shots at them, and they get into cover. And it's when they're in cover, they realise that Davidson had a little hole in his hat, in his tam o' shanter, and realised that the sniper had just missed the top of his head. And so you can see almost the exact direction of the bullet in the top of the hat, which is just, really quite terrifying, but yeah, again, amazing that he it didn't go any lower. So yeah.
The moment when he must have realised when he took his tam o' shanter off, I wonder what his first thoughts were.
Oh, jeez, it's just like, what's for dinner tonight, probably, Or I think I'd quite like to leave now. I think probably was the. But no, it was amazing.
He may have even thought, I think I'm going to have a pint tonight.
Yeah, probably, yeah. That's probably what he was thinking. Enough for me. So here we are, kind of really at the end of the history of the Gordon Highlanders, really, and this is us at the end of our main exhibit, at the end of the grant room. So we've covered 200 years of regimental history of the Gordon Highlanders. So in 1994, it's exactly 200 years after the Gordon Highlanders was first formed, they're amalgamated with the Queen's Own Highlanders to form the new regiment, simply known as the Highlanders. And basically from then on out, that's kind of how they're known. And then our kind of closest modern regiment that we've got today is Four Scots. And it's a photo that we've got here of a Four Scots soldier with still a piece of Gordon tartan underneath the webbing on his helmet. And so it's actually kind of around this time that the museum actually starts to become a thing, kind of once it's been amalgamated into the Highlanders and then eventually the Royal Regiment of Scotland later on. That's kind of when it starts to become the concept of the museum was kind of really born of the Gordon Highlanders itself wasn't a regiment anymore. It's time to kind of properly display the collection that was already part of the mess and expand it and kind of tell the story of the Gordon Highlanders. So a few of the items that we've got in here are just to do with pretty much all Four Scots and specifically their involvement in Afghanistan. So a plate carrier, another tam o' shanter, a Romanian AKM that had been picked up. And then our final survival story, our last one that we discuss, Craig Patterson, who was not as lucky as Mr. Davidson in that the bullet strayed a little bit lower than you'd want it to and did actually hit him in the head. And in this photo, you can actually see him getting transported onto a Chinook in 2011. And he, again, miraculously lives. And for a long time, we weren't actually sure if he was how he was doing. And then it was in a newspaper. It was a photo of him with a jar with a little bit of his skull basically in the jar, which is what they had to do in the surgery to basically make sure that he lived. And then later on, him on his wedding day. So he's getting on amazingly well. And kind of, again, tenacity and courage to the finest degree.
I've already said it, but I'm going to say it again. It seems to be the theme of the Gordons.
Yeah, it definitely seems to be the theme of the Gordons. And so we still have got a really good close relation with Four Scots as well. So they're often come into the museum and do tours, and we get the Four Scots pipe band as well sometimes play for us. So we really kind of try and keep a connection to that modern element and where that regiment is now. And yes, that takes us to the end of the grant room and the end of the main exhibition. But thankfully we've got more, so that's not just it. So we've got a little bit more downstairs, so we may as well go down there. So we're in our armory. So we've now come from the upstairs part of the museum. We've now gone downstairs, and you'll see a little bit more about it as we go through the halls. But we are actually now in the original part of the building. So what was originally the coffee merchant's house that I mentioned at the very beginning. But this is our armory. It's really one of the most spectacular rooms in the whole building, I think, and goes to show from beginning to end, really what was being issued as service weapons for the British Army and to the Gordon Highlanders, but also a few weapons that have kind of been picked up on their adventures and kind of in a similar nature to I was talking about the MP38 that had been used like through the duration of war. We've got a few things that are very similar to that. So it starts off with your Brown Bess flintlock musket. So that's what would have been getting used at the very beginning in 1794. And so smooth bore flintlock, not very accurate. You'd struggle to hit the broadside of a barn with it, but it was what was issued at the time. And so you stay smooth bore, no rifling into the barrel until around about here when you get into the Enfield rifle, and then you get into your Martini Henry as well. So if you've seen Zulu, that's what they're using in that, kind of pretty famously in that. And then someone has decided to modify this Martini Henry here and make it into a shortened version there. So that's your kind of first set of rifles that are issued to the Gordon Highlanders. In this kind of next cabinet, this is a lot to do with some of the connections between the Gordons and the SOE, so the Special Operations Executive, which is kind of I guess you could say kind of a precursor to the SAS in a way, and kind of generally the Special Forces institution in the British Army. And Geoffrey was part of the 2nd Battalion in the Second World War, but he was involved in the SOE in 1943. So after the unsuccessful defense of Malaya, he's transferred to the SOE. And he is actually parachuted into southern France and is helping the French revolutionaries basically in occupied Paris, I believe, is where he ended up. And then whilst he was doing that, he ends up basically making preparations for the Normandy landings in D-Day. So he's got a very kind of important involvement in kind of shifting German defences away from Normandy and kind of basically setting traps for supplies to get transported and things like that. And so he was using a variety of weapons, hence why we've got them here. So he at points was using an MP40, the next version of the MP38 that we saw upstairs, and occasionally decided to go American and had an M1 carbine with him. A German Luger as well that we've got as part of the collection. So the SOE connection is always really interesting. From here, kind of returning back to the service rifle evolution, from your breech loading Martinis into your bolt action rifles, so your number 1 Mark III Lee Enfield from the First World War, and then your number 4 Mark I that you would have been seeing in the Second World War. And I think you pointed out you quite like the fact that that has got the scope on it. Yeah,
it's not very common to see them.
No, it's quite a rare thing. So we're always very happy to kind of show that off in this collection. And then from the Lee Enfield goes into the SLRs over here, based on the Belgian FN files, and then into the first generation of the SA-80. So that's an L85A1. We are now on L85A3. I think we're on the 3rd generation now, and it's a bit of a Marmite rifle. The SA-80, certainly the first one. It's had a bit of backlash when it first got released, and
there's plenty of feedback, especially from the Gulf War. Its reliability.
And magazines flying out when you're running with them and stuff like that. So it's come a long way. Let's put it that way. So apart from the British service rifles, we've got a few other rifles from other fighting nations. We've got some German Gewehrs here. I really like the 98 Gewehr with the straight bolt on it, and also kind of one of the most accurate rifles that there ever really was the Gewehr. The kind of only disadvantage that it had in comparison to the Lee Enfield was the magazine capacity. And that was basically the advantage that Lee Enfield had almost over every other combat rifle during the First World War, was that it had 5 more rounds on average than every other bolt action rifle. and was famously confused for machine gun fire when it was being fired in volleys, and it's an iconic weapon. And then we've got probably equally as iconic, but not for the British Army, but for the US Army, the M1 Grand with its pretty famous ping when it gets to the bottom of its magazine, and then the Thompson as well, which the Thompson really heavy, despite the fact that it's quite small.
I've noticed that for previous experiences.
Yeah, it's for what it's something to do with the mechanism. It's just unbelievably heavy. You'll see kind of along the bottom of the cases, we've got a few more of the kind of ceremonial things and a few other kind of combat daggers as well. But one of the ones again connecting it to the Scottish dress and the regimental dress, all the dirks along the bottom here that were part of your ceremonial dress, and the wee handles on the side. Initially, for a long time, myself included, it was thought that they were basically smaller knives, but it's actually cutlery. It's a knife and fork, just in case you need to have a meal on the go. And so we've got tons of them, tons of kukris as well, as we've kind of mentioned with the Heights of Dargai, super close connection to the Nepalese Gurkhas. And so we've been graciously donated a vast collection of kukris. So we're very, very proud to have those. And then on the regimental front and on that connection to the regiment front, our collection of broadswords as well. So we've got some kind of newer ones and then some really old ones as well, kind of dating back to the 1800s with some of those. And so yeah, we're really proud of our armory. It's something I think it looks really good and shows off a variety of things from what was being issued as well as things that have been collected over the regimental travels. So we're very, very proud of it.
It's a fantastic setup the way it's been done.
It's a good space and lets us also show off quite a large collection of medals, which is in here. So obviously got all of our medals that are part of our grant room cases, and then we've got even more in here. It just goes to show the breadth of medals that were also being issued at the time, and also kind of gives a little opportunity to talk about bars and how bars basically what they actually represent in terms of both achievements and conflicts someone's been a part of. And so I saw Robert Watt, he had his 6 or 7 bars that he had on his, which is almost kind of makes it look even more impressive when you see. So a lot of people had 3 or 4. You know, if you've got that many, it's a lot of bars to have on one medal. And then also here, some of the ceremonial weapons, so Indian Rajput daggers, and then the ceremonial kukris as well. So their blades will actually be engraved as well.
You see some of the beautiful detail in it.
It's amazing,
the
yeah.
golden gild on the blade.
Absolutely,
here.
yeah. And it's on the blade itself, some of them have actually got personal messages to the Gordon Highlanders written on them, and they are the gilding paired with that it's completely gorgeous. The silver details on the sheath as well. It's incredibly well done. And again, so very proud of our connection to the Nepalese Gurkhas. That's actually one there where you can see the engravings with 1st Battalion Gordon Highlanders written on it. So yeah, dead proud of these. These are really, really great parts of the collection. So we've transitioned along the hall. We are now in our regimental silver room. So this is showing off a plethora of regimental silver. Silver plays a really important role in a lot of regiments in terms of being part of the mess hall. Was kind of one of the original main functions of them for the purpose of drinking, eating. And you can see that with these champagne jugs here, some of the goblets that are here, and some of the cutlery and plates here. So all for the purpose of being part of the mess hall. And but alongside that, we've got a few things that are kind of denoting achievements, sporting cups that we've got along here for shooting prizes. There was the Gordons famously, it was kind of pre-Second World War, I believe. It was in Malaya. They're holding a boxing competition with amongst other regiments. And the Gordon Highlanders won in every single weight class, and so they were issued quite a lot of boxing trophies. So we've got boxing trophies, shooting trophies, athletics, tug of war, lots of things that were basically made in silver for presents. And one of my favourites, mostly just because they're a bit wacky in lots of ways, is our snuff boxes. So these ones are all ram horn snuff boxes, which were pretty common for snuff boxes. And for those of you who don't know, snuff is ground tobacco that was, instead of being smoked, was snorted through the nose. And it was, a lot of these snuff boxes were basically paired with little spoons, little miniature spoons, and then a little rabbit's foot to basically remove kind of excess snuff. I always think it seemed a little bit not very classy to be snorting at the dinner table, but it was really kind of a big part of tradition, and it was still used in officers' messes and things. And so these are all ram's horns that are adorned with silver, and I always find them really fascinating.
There's a craftsmanship that goes into some of these as well. It's just
Unbelievable.
outstanding.
Yeah, and so the kind of other thing when you're not snorting tobacco is smoking it. And so we've got a few things here to do with smoking, and my absolute favourite one, and it might be my favourite thing in this whole room, is what's called Jock by the Campfire, which is that statuette at the top. And you can kind of see that it's got a kind of wick kind of at the front of it.
Yeah.
Almost looks like it's kind of got logs around it. That lights, and it actually looks like a campfire, and it's got embers underneath it, and it's honestly breathtaking. And those little kind of pillars at the side, those are little wicks that basically come out, and then you can light it, and it's for lighting cigars is what it's intended for. But it's breathtaking. And so occasionally we hold regimental dinners. We call ours their Baidan dinner, but we also do centenaries of certain battles and events. And so stuff comes out of here and goes into our regimental dining room, which we'll see, or it goes up into our gallery. And at our recent dinner, we had the pleasure of bringing that out and having that as a bit of a centerpiece, and it was a favourite. Yeah, it was really great. And so, as I say, achievements, enjoying time in the mess, and also memorialising the regiment. So cast in silver, Duchess Jean handing out the King's Shilling, similar to the painting that you saw at the very beginning. And then you'll see, kind of across all of it, you'll see things like the crest with the stag, with the regimental motto Baidans written on it. And you'll also see tigers and sphinxes being adorned upon them. Now the tigers and sphinxes are referring to the 75th Stirlingshire Regiment and the 92nd Regiment. The 92nd Regiment is the original Gordon Highlanders Regiment, but in 1884 it amalgamates with the 75th to just form the Gordon Highlanders. And before that amalgamation, they had their own cap badges. And if I remember correctly, India is the tiger, so then the tiger is on the 75th cap badge, and then Egypt is the Sphinx, and so the Sphinx was the 92nd cap badge. So that's why you'll see those things adorned on the silver, and throughout the collection you'll see sphinxes, tigers, that sort of thing. So this is, I like to think of as silver part 1. There's more silver along the whole, and a few other things that we may as well go have a look at.
Sure.
Let's do it. So we are in our temporary exhibit space now. So this is our D-Day 80 exhibition. So this was opened up this year. This was to celebrate the 80th anniversary of the Normandy landings. And so this is our space that basically churns out a new temporary exhibition every year. So we're hoping to do one next year that is the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. And so this will be here until next May, and just kind of goes through a lot of the really amazing stories of the Gordon Highlanders that were there at the landings in Normandy. And I'm going to start with a very light-hearted one. That's more of a chuckle that was featured on our social media recently, which is to do with that little clasp knife in the kind of back right of this case here. And what's really amusing about that, it was that clasp knife was lost basically during the landings on Normandy. And basically the soldier that lost it, he ended up receiving an invoice from the British Army because it was a broad arrow. It was owned equipment by the British Army, and so they sent him an invoice saying you need to send us this money basically to compensate for losing that. sent the money, and then years and years and years later, a friend of his is basically going around in France and ends up finding the clasp knife and then sending it back to his friend. And so the first thing the friend does is write to the British Army saying, "Can I get my money back, please? Because I've got it now." And they actually did. They ended up sending him, I think it was like £2 and a shilling or something for the clasp knife, and it was just really something that was just a weird and kind of wonderful story. And D-Day for me is filled with those, and is one of the most outstanding, unbelievable events of the Second World War. Not just for the scenario in terms of the men that are landing on the beach, which is amazingly done with this diorama here. That's Juno Beach that's been depicted there. But the preparations that went into it, it was years of planning that was to such an extreme extent. I think one of my favorites being the inflatable artillery that was being placed on strategic locations in the south of England that basically made it look like they were going to be attacking somewhere else. And because Normandy, despite being incredibly fortified, was actually not that fortified compared to other parts of the Atlantic Wall, I think is what it was called. And so this whole exhibit is basically designed to go from planning and preparation to the execution of D-Day.
See, during D-Day as well, was the Gordon specifically just on the one beach, or were they on multiple beaches?
Juno Beach was one of the main ones they were on, but there's a good chance they would have been on multiple. And a lot of the involvement of the Gordon Highlanders was actually in Normandy when they were pushing into France as well. That was where a lot of the fighting that they were involved with was happening, and that was actually where one of our favourite stories to tell is to do with Jim Glennie, who landed at Normandy, helped push into France, and was injured and taken as a prisoner of war by the Germans. And was in the same clothes that he landed in Normandy in for the entire time that he was a prisoner of war, before eventually being liberated by some American soldiers and given some fresh clothes, thankfully. And one of the most amazing things about him is that he's still a tour guide here today, and he just turned 99. So he's gonna be in tomorrow morning, and he comes in every week, and he's outstanding. He's a great guy.
Yeah. You need to make sure you let him ken that we said happy birthday.
We will do, don't worry, yeah. We'll pass that on. So as I say, this will be here until next May, and then we'll have a new exhibit all to do with it. And then the only thing that'll be sad is that we won't have the Vickers gun in here anymore, but there's that.
See, for your next exhibit, any idea what we're going to be getting next?
So the idea is to celebrate both VE Day and VJ Day. So again, we take a lot of pride in the Eastern Theatre kind of being a big part of the Gordon Highlanders history, as well as the Western Theatre. And so we really want to kind of discuss both of those days, and kind of in my head I think about not just the war ending, but what happened kind of directly after, about what the impact of the war was, and kind of how people kind of recuperated from it. And wanting to tell as many stories as we possibly can. So we run a TV in here that talks about, there's got interviews featured, with interview with Jim Glennie is one of the featured interviews. And so we're hoping to kind of continue that, about having interviews to do with the end of the Second World War. So that's the idea anyway. So we'll see what happens.
We'll certainly need to come back and
absolutely
see a new exhibition.
Please do, absolutely. That'll be great. Fantastic. Right, we'll do next room.
Yep.
So we're in, which is probably on a traditional tour. This is probably kind of one of the last stops. This is our regimental dining room, which is kind of meant to reflect as close to what the mess hall and the dining room would have been when this was a regimental headquarters. And so we try and keep it as original as we can. As part of that, we've got tons of the regimental silver that you saw in the silver room displayed on the table and displayed in the mantelpieces. So lots of things to do with eating, lots of things to do with drinking, and as well as smoking as well. And featured in this room, depiction of the Heights of Dargai. It's talking about George Finlater. That's him with his injured ankles up against the rock as the Gordon Highlanders charge the hill. And then we've got the Queen's colours and the regiment's colours displayed in the back of the room. Famously, the colours have never been captured in the heat of battle and are still displayed as part of the museum. And that's one of the first items that was ever accessioned, I think, with the colours. I think they're item 3 and 4 or something on the list. So that's one of the most fascinating ones. And speaking of fascinating, that tall fruit stand, that's I guess what you could call Singapore silver, where during the fall of Singapore, lots of regimental silver was basically lost. And that fruit stand was one of those pieces. And it was basically lost for years and years and years, and then ended up in an eBay auction back in Scotland. I think it was in Edinburgh. Don't know how it got back here, but it's back in our collection now, and it's on display on our table.
As well, you mentioned earlier about the goblets, that on each goblet there's a name.
Yes. So kind of going back to the kind of purpose of the silver, one of the things was kind of you were presented with silver on particular achievements. So promotion could be one, getting married could be one, upon leaving the army could be one. And one of the very common ones was to receive a goblet for that. And so along the rim of each gauntlet, goblet, I should say, not gauntlet, there is a name and then with a reason why that goblet was then made. So it will say Major Ogilvy, for an example, received upon promotion to Major, as an example. And so you can actually book out this room for events, and so it's always quite interesting to, when you get presented with the goblet, to see who's on it, why they got it. So, but yeah, it's one of the most gorgeous rooms in the museum, and we really try and keep it as original as we can. So yeah.
When you're talking about the bookings, what's the typical style of booking that you get? Is it wedding venues? Is it for anniversaries?
Yeah, that kind of thing, yeah. So at weddings, we would maybe do upstairs in the gallery, and kind of bigger events do upstairs in the gallery. But it can be as simple as you just want to be able to eat in here. But you can get everything for a piper's entrance and things like that. But yes, absolutely, weddings, anniversaries. This room is used for centenaries. It's always done to a spectacular level when it's done, and it's attention to detail, we're very proud of it.
Yeah, it's all been beautifully laid out.
Yeah, thank you very much. No, it's a really, really pretty room, and it's always people are always really big fans of this room when they come on tours. So we're very proud of it.
Amazing. Well, Jamie, thanks very much for taking the time out your day and showing us around the museum. It's been an amazing experience. I'd highly recommend to anybody that's watching this to come up here. Pile of Gordon's a good visit. Have a look around. There's no short of amazing stories. Once you're done, go up to the cafe, have a wee bite to eat or a wee drink, or treat yourself to a book or another wee type of souvenir.
Thank you very much. My absolute pleasure. No, it's been really great showing you guys around, and glad to hear you enjoy it. And it's been great to kind of celebrate the Gordons in the way that I like to do. So yeah, it's been fantastic. So thank you very much.
Just before we wrap it there, is there any events coming up in the museum or anything like that?
So we'll be doing kind of a few events with people coming in to the gallery and to the dining room, a few things. But we won't be, as far as I know, nothing in terms of big public events coming up too soon. But in the event that there is, we'll be putting that out on our social media. So we do reenactment events. And then obviously when we get our temporary exhibition up and going, we'll be putting that up. So if you follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, we're on all of those, just at the Gordon Highlanders Museum. You can keep up with us there.
That's great. Well, again, Jamie, thanks very much for
Thank you very much. My pleasure. Appreciate it.